All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we got some things set up on the back end there. Appreciate everybody joining us today. For those that don't know me, I'm Carolyn Van Hoovel, and I'm Executive Director with the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture. We are going to be recording this webinar, and we are set up in webinar feature. So I'll go over how to ask questions shortly. We're happy to have our presenters here today with us, our partners at Department of Natural Resources and Department of Agriculture, to really cover some information that we've had lots of questions about from membership, including human wildlife conflict stamps and how they can be used in the application process, the outline of the wildlife compensation program and how to apply and receive that, along with some information on the programs available to support on-farm wildlife mitigation efforts in advance. So the way we're going to run today is that we're going to have folks do their presentations. So Trisha, Alicia, and Rebecca will all be doing their presentations, and then we're going to do an open forum Q&A. So we're going to ask folks to keep their questions to the end to make sure that we get through all of the content. You are able to use the Q&A function as well as a chat function. So if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to drop them in there, and then we'll come back to them at the end. So since we're in webinar mode, your microphones and cameras will remain off during the session. As I mentioned, you can use the Q&A function and chat function, and those can be found at the bottom of your screen on the panel bar. And then when we move into the question section and you want to ask that live, you can use the raise hand feature, and then Catherine will be here and able to unmute you for that. So I think we are going to get started. We want this to be informative and interactive, so take advantage of the opportunities to ask those questions, and we will do any follow-up that we need to do following the session as well. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Trisha Fleming with the Department of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much. All right, just gonna make sure that you can see my screen. Are you seeing that now? My presentation? Yes? Great.
We can see the notes section, Trisha, so you might want to flip it so we can see just the presentation component, which will, there we go, we're all set.
All right, excellent. So I'm Trisha Fleming, and I'm the Human Wildlife Coexistence Biologist at the Wildlife Division with Department of Natural Resources and Renewables. And one of my roles is to manage the Human Wildlife Conflict Stamp Policy. And this program has recently gone through an update. And so I'm going to focus most of my presentation on that update, but I'll also give some background information for anybody who has not heard of this program before. So to give that general background of what this program is, and so the Human Wildlife Conflict Stamps come from the General Wildlife Regulations. And essentially, if you boil it down, it's permission to kill a deer or bear. But there obviously are some stipulations with that. And so the department might give a stamp to a farmer experiencing crop or other damage with significant economic loss. And that the damage has to be caused by a deer or bear, not another species. Those stamps might also be provided to a person with permission to represent this farmer. And somebody who is receiving a stamp must hold a valid base license, so can hunt, and be certified to hunt with a weapon authorized for hunting deer and bear. And we're going to dive into some more of this if not all of this makes sense. And so how this program might support agriculture. So there is potential that removing specific animals might, stop or reduce that damage to a more tolerable level. I think of, that bear mowing down a cornfield. If that one specific bear is removed, perhaps that damage will stop or be reduced. The other potential is that once that animal is removed, another animal might come and take its place. Or for the case of bears, if we're removing, mature male bears that are defending their territory, then we are potentially opening up that territory to immature bears that might not behave as well. So it might help reduce the damage, it might not. Often this helps too in situations where you've had deer get into fenced areas. So apple orchards, for example, and then, removing those specific animals is really what we need to do to reduce the damage. Hunting pressure, and I put a question mark here because I'm not sure. And so I get this argument of if we have more hunting on the landscape, where we want it at the times we want it, so in and outside of the regular hunting season, will that decrease damage? And often what we see, particularly for deer, is that deer just go nocturnal. And so they're still causing the damage, but we're not necessarily seeing them do the damage. So you're seeing less deer on the landscape because you're not seeing them at night. And so it might help for hunting pressure, but it might not. We're not quite sure about that one either. I do hear from farmers, that say, if I have 2 or 3 stamps to kill deer, that's 2 or 3 deer that I no longer have to deal with next year damaging my crop. And so does it actually equal to less damage overall? Again, we're not quite sure. And so I wanted to bring this up because for those who are interested in the program, I just want the expectations to be where they need to be to, what this program can and cannot do to support you. But it also might be a support that helps reduce the perception that, farmers are having with what is damage and what they can tolerate and not. And so the process has gone through an update recently. And, I hear frequently, either directly from farmers or from staff who are working directly with farmers, that the process that we had before was just too long. It took too long. Often when applications are coming in, it's when damage is happening now. And you don't want to wait a week. You don't want to wait longer than a week because the damage is happening at that moment. And so we appreciated that. And we also were getting frustrated with the time it was taking on our end. And so one of the big pushes for this update was to reduce that application processing time. We also wanted to make the application smoother and to be more inclusive. We always have animal welfare and sustainable wildlife management at heart. And so we made sure that the update also reflected that. And we wanted to have a consistent approach across the province. Okay, so diving into some more of the details. So to be an eligible applicant, it's only authorized for a farmer who demonstrates that deer or bear are causing crop or other damage to the farming operation with significant economic loss to the farmer. And so that sentence is really at the crux at how we relate back to the wildlife regulations. And so one of the pieces we needed to determine was what is the significant economic loss? And so we're defining that as loss or damage is at least 2 acres or $250 worth of damage. And we took that directly from the Wildlife Compensation Program so that we're in line with them. And the reality in today's world is that it is not that challenging to reach that bar of $250 worth of damage because things cost so much. However, this is not for activities that aren't related to a farming operation. And so items that are not for profit or trade. So for example, a backyard hobby like chicken coop, that would not be appropriate for this process. Previously, we had a requirement that farmers applying had to be registered farms. We have removed that requirement to increase inclusivity. So if you're interested in applying for the process, there is now a new application form. So if you have an old form, I highly recommend that you get a new one. The new forms were designed so there's good information up front about what the program is, how to apply, and the questions are very tailored so that we get the exact information we need to make a decision on your application. And so we're not asking extra information. You can get one of these from your local office and they can be emailed to you as well. The completed forms are sent back to the technician or the local regional biologist. Ideally via email, they are a fillable PDF, or you can print them off and send them into your local office. The applicant has to be the farmer or have permission from the farmer to apply on their behalf. Another item that is new this time round is that the evidence can be provided by the applicant at the time of the application. We're going to talk more about that, but previous to that, there had to be a site visit by one of our staff. So that may or may not happen. And so site visits might still happen, and that would occur if the evidence is not provided or completely provided in the application. There needs to be a verification of evidence, or maybe there's additional information that we need. So what does that evidence look like? We need the date of the damage. And this just gives us some ideas. Ideally, you are applying for this process when the damage is happening or just after it's happening. You know, if the damage happened a year ago or a couple months ago, it just makes it more challenging for us to determine if this meets the bar or not. So that's why we need the date. We need to know that the damage occurred on the farm in question and matches the PIDs on the application form. And so this is our making sure that this is actually happening on a farm that this farmer is associated with. That loss has to be showed with that farming operation, as we've already discussed. The damage is at least that 2 acres or at least $250. And damage was caused by deer or bear. Again, it can't be another species. So how you can submit that evidence, acceptable forms, you can do photos and videos are great, and they indicate the date and location. And just as a heads up, smartphones and digital cameras usually automatically save that information, so the date and location, unless you have disabled that feature in your settings. And our staff have guidance documents on how they can retrieve that information from what you send in. You can also provide physical evidence, for example, a damaged hive, but we would need more information on top of that, the date, location, species, for example. But if you don't want to provide that evidence, that's completely fine. It just means that a site visit will need to occur, so the application time will be a little longer. So to authorize human-wildlife conflict stamps, obviously the eligibility and the evidence needs to be met. Usually we're providing these in situations where the preventative measures are either not reasonable. For example, you have a very, very, very large field that's not reasonable to fence the whole thing. Or maybe, you only have corn in that field that year. And so again, fencing doesn't make sense. So it's not reasonable, or they're not effective. So the preventative measures are being appropriately used, but they're still not being effective. Could also be for a first-time applicant where damage is expected to be high even before implementing those preventative measures. So we're making a recommendation, you need to put up this fence, you need to do this, but we appreciate that you're going to receive a lot of damage before that happens, so we'll help you out. Or there's a high probability that damage occurs even after the preventative measures are in place, so that dedicated bear that is just not going to stop going to those hives. For repeat applicants, there needs to be reasonable justification for not implementing preventative measures if they've been recommended in the past. And so previous to this, if you applied and the application was then reviewed by essentially a small committee of folks in the department, which took some time. And so now we've changed that bar a bit. We are now the technician at the local office. If all of the information is appropriate and the bars are met, they can issue upfront up to 5 stamps for deer and up to 3 stamps for bear. If after filling that level, you still feel you have a problem and you'd like more, it doesn't mean you can't get them. It just means then we have to go to that committee for more discussion. So it's just a little bit of a longer process afterwards, but this gives us a chance to help you out right up front. There are, however, situations where we do not usually authorize human-wildlife conflict stamps. And here's some examples. So to remove female deer or bear with dependent young. So fawns are dependent from April to September, cubs from January to September. But now what's different is that you can still harvest male animals during that time. So before this, if you had an alfalfa field that was getting grazed by deer and causing a lot of damage, you couldn't apply for something or come to us until September. And so that was after the crop was already taken up, damage was already done. Now you can hunt male deer during that time. There's also that flexibility that technicians could put in a longer time frame for when you can use the stamps. So it could roll in past September where you can then harvest female deer as well. So that's a good change. Another situation is when damage has not yet occurred. So those preemptive stamps, like there's a bear roaming around. It hasn't done anything yet, but it's going to do something. At least I think it is, and I want it removed. And so we're trying to avoid situations like that. The damage has to occur first before we are removing animals. The other situation, the crop or livestock experiencing damage are harvested prior to human-wildlife conflict stamps. So again, that relates back to that example of the alfalfa field. And so before we had farmers applying in September when the crop's already gone. And so it's hard for us to relate providing stamps in September, how it relates back to preventing the damage that happened in July. And so we're trying to avoid that as well. However, if you would like to apply for one of these situations, you can make a case on your application form, just understanding that these situations will take a longer time to process because it takes more conversation from internal partners. So the recipient eligibility, so this is for the hunter. So that person has to be named as a hunter on the application form. They have to hold a valid base license, so a habitat stamp. They have to be certified to harvest with a weapon authorized for hunting deer or bear. They need to be permitted to hunt in Nova Scotia without restrictions or suspensions. And they need to have submitted all required reports and biological collections from other human wildlife conflict stamps that they've had received, if that's applicable. And for us to issue stamps, each stamp is permitted to harvest one deer or one bear. And for bear, that can be hunting or snaring. We don't snare for deer. These stamps are in addition to the regular harvest allowance. So if it's in the hunting season, that and you're trying to encourage hunters to come to your property instead of going somewhere else where they like to hunt, these are in addition to their regular allowances. Another new feature is we've removed the fees. There's no longer fees associated with human wildlife conflict stamps. Just as a note, they are issued to only one hunter. So, for example, if you stamp 303, that only goes to one hunter. It can't be used by a hunter, to more than one hunter. They're not transferable. So, for example, if you had 5 stamps for deer, you might want 2 to go to one hunter, maybe 3 to go to another. That's up for debate, but that's just how it works in network. There's now no limit on the number of stamps per individuals. Before we had, you could have one stamp and then you had to come back to the office to get another one if you were allowed up to 5, for example. We understood that was difficult for people who didn't live close to offices or if they wanted one on a weekend. And so now there's no limit to the amount you can have at one point. We'd also like the meat to be donated to Feed Nova Scotia. Obviously, there can be some limitations to that. So whether the meat is unsuitable for human consumption, there's not a local approved butcher, or there could be another reason that is listed in the terms and conditions. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Trisha. There are a few questions in the Q&A, but we are going to do the other presentations first. But just so folks know, we will come back to those questions that are there. So with that, I will hand it over to Alicia to provide an update related to wildlife compensation. Oh, you're just still on mute there, Alicia.
Sorry, when I shared it made my whole screen go away except what I was sharing. So can you guys see that now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Alicia Parsons-Lushington. I'm the manager at Nova Scotia Crop and Livestock Insurance Commission, and we administer the wildlife compensation program for the province. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about that. Starting now, and I'm just putting a little timer so I can keep track of myself here. Can I make it? There we go. So we have, oh, I don't like how my screen's there. Well, okay. So we have the wildlife compensation program that compensates Nova Scotia farmers who experience damage caused by wildlife to eligible agricultural crops. So the philosophy there is that we know that wildlife is a positive part of citizens' experience of living in Nova Scotia. And we also recognize that sometimes farmers pay the price of supporting those wildlife more than other citizens do. And so this program was intended to kind of compensate producers for some of that cost of wildlife in our areas. So the program's administered by us. It's not an insurance like most of the other things we do. It's when the thing happens, you tell us about it, and then under certain circumstances that I'm going to get into, you would receive a compensation payment. That payment is made 40% by the provincial government and 60% by the federal government, but it's entirely administered by us. It's been available since 2008, and it is currently for registered farmers only. We cover both crops and livestock in this program. So for crops, all crops that are currently insured by us are also eligible for wildlife compensation. And there's a list of actually 15 animals that the damage could be caused by, but the big ones that we see are black bear, deer, and kind of various birds. And you see the list there telling you kind of all of them. Under livestock, we currently cover dairy animals, beef animals, sheep and goats, and then beehives, honey, and bumblebees, which under the kind of strange definitions of Nova Scotia Crop and Livestock Insurance, those are considered livestock. And the animals that we cover there, the wildlife that may be causing the damage could be bear, coyote, fox, wildcat, ravens, crows, and other birds of prey. So what do you need to do to get this type of compensation? Basically, it's really quite simple. And it has been something that people have mentioned to me before that they didn't bother to kind of pursue because they were worried that it was complicated or they might not have enough information. But the big thing is that within 72 hours of the damage, you have to give us a call. You can email us, you can text us, you can call us. And if you're able to, you could take pictures because sometimes our staff will go out and have a look at the kind of the dead animal. If it's crops, we'll almost always come look at it. But sometimes with the animals, if something's been, killed in the pasture, you can take some really good photos of that evidence, and that provides us with what we need to be able to process an application. A few more things that need to be considered when somebody is kind of considering whether the loss that they've experienced is something that they should get in touch with us. And I will say, if you've experienced the loss, you should get in touch, and then we can talk to you about whether or not that makes sense. But producers are expected to use best industry management practices to control or prevent wildlife damage. We're well aware that sometimes there's nothing that you can do, and I think that Tricia spoke to that as well. But the expectation is that people are trying, like livestock should be fenced, fencing should be, reasonable to keep the livestock in, and possibly, deter wildlife from entering the pastures. Sometimes there'll be things like, it just makes sense maybe if you're, if you have sheep and they're being attacked kind of quite regularly, that you're bringing them closer to the barn, or you're putting, you have dogs or donkeys, or you're using cameras to see what's going on and that kind of thing. So there'd be discussions about that, but basically best management practices for sure are expected. Our field staff need to be able to inspect the losses or determine the cause of the probable cause of loss. So what we mean there is, it doesn't really work for us if somebody calls and says, I had something happen, it was 48 hours ago, but I've destroyed all the evidence and I need you to take my word for it. So there are times we don't visit farms because we're able to look at photos, or we already know what's going on that farm, but we need to have that opportunity to make the decision as to whether or not we can have a look or not. So the best thing to do is to call us as soon as it happens. That gives us the chance to kind of pop out there and have a look. Another thing I've heard a lot of is people say, well, it happened on like Friday night. Leave a message on Friday night. That's the easiest thing to do, because what happens is sometimes people forget, and then it gets to be like Tuesday or Wednesday the next week, and they're like, oh, I meant to call and tell them about that. Just call when it happens. We have answering machines. We have staff that like to answer the phone on the weekends, and they will. We have staff that don't. Both are fine. Your message is there. There's a time and date stamp on it, and we'll proceed from there. And then the crop damage must affect an area of at least 2 acres, or the loss is a value of at least $250. And that's just because, there can be very minor feeding on crops that probably doesn't warrant like this kind of, inspection and so on, and a payment. But if there's something significant, we want to know about it. In the case of livestock, if an animal, needs to be euthanized due to wildlife predation, or it was killed, we consider that to be significant amount of damage. You don't have to wait till there's more than one or something like that. but not. So there's a few things that we can't cover. If the crop is harvested or the animal is disposed of before the reporting. So when you see that damage, even if you're in your harvester, if you're on the tractor and you start driving around to harvest and you see that there's corn down that you couldn't tell from the road or from your vantage point, then just, I know nobody wants to stop kind of when they're harvesting, but stop long enough to send us a text. Then we'll get out there as soon as we can while you're in you can carry on with your process kind of thing. If the damage occurs after most of the crop in the area is already harvested, so we kind of find that, if there's one cornfield that's there and everything else is already harvested, it's the only thing in the area that's left, that's definitely where the wildlife are going, because everybody else has just removed their source of easy nutrition, and so they're going to your field. So those fields, there comes a time when we do a bit of a cutoff and we say, you know what, everything else around here has been harvested, and the harvest date for our insurance products have passed, and then we're not able to do any more payments. And in the case where the producer fails to take measures to mitigate losses, where there are measures available, then that would be a time when we weren't able to pay. But like I said earlier, we often recognize that just nothing works, and we're not looking to find reasons to not pay people. We're just looking to find ways to pay compensation that we can justify, and we can kind of we can kind of keep track of what the reasoning and that is, because we have to justify where the money goes to. And very quickly, I just want to give you an idea of what kind of money goes out through this program. So starting back in 2009 and going to 2023, 2024 isn't quite over yet for us. You can see that some years are more payments made, some years are less. I think that varies based on populations probably, and also based on sort of the appetite of the producer to get in touch with us and ask us to come out and take a look. And I will say 2024 is quite low compared to 23 at this time, and I don't see that changing in the next few days before our year is over. If you wanted to know how many payments, how much of the money that was paid out over the years went to what commodity or to what wildlife, you can see that white-tailed deer by far exceeds everything else. That is not recent, that those white-tailed deer dollars, they're steady now, but they were really big in the beginning of the program. Right now, our most frequent customer are bears and coyotes. And just a really quick look at some of the things that we're looking at. So this is the kind of photos that people are sending us. You have beehives destroyed here, and we're looking at paying for the parts that are actually destroyed. So sometimes you can have a beehive that's hit by bears, and you'll see that that the outer box, like the box, the super is still intact, and we expect those to be cleaned up and reused. But a frame that's all busted to pieces, or foundation, or a brood that's missing, we pay for those kind of things. And just another picture before we get to the end of what we're looking at. This is a case where bear damage in corn that wasn't super recent when we flew it. Now, the person would have called us when it was recent and we would have went out, but normally in the case of something like this, we'll say, okay, let's wait till just before harvest. We can have a look and see how extensive the damage is. And in this case, the damage is pretty extensive. We see a lot of stuff like that. And like I said, questions, but I think we're going to wait till the end of the presentations for those. But if you have some, kind of jot them down to yourself or put them in the sidebar there so we can get to them at the end. And thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Now we will go to Rebecca to provide us an update on the mitigation programs with Department of Agriculture, and then we'll flip over to questions.
All right, thanks, Carolyn. So my name is Rebecca Suxom. I'm Director of Programs with the Department of Agriculture. If this webinar was a couple of weeks out, I could talk about our 25-26 program. So this is going to be covering what was offered in the 24-25 fiscal year. In 24-25, we had a program that helped farmers protect crops and livestock from wildlife damage. It was open for farms generating gross commodity income of at least $30,000. Farms that were under $30,000 in farm revenue were able to apply for the same items through the Get Growing program. We cover portable and permanent fencing, deterrent devices, livestock guard animals, etc., at a 50% cost share up to $15,000 or 10% of farm income, whichever was lesser. So examples of things that we covered were perimeter or permanent fencing or portable electric fencing for the prevention of crop damage. The portable electric fencing was also available for beekeepers. Mechanical deterrent devices to prevent bird predation on fruit crops, as well as, so including crop netting, scare cannons, bangers, whalers, and scare lights, and livestock guardian animals for livestock farms, such as accepted breeds of dogs like Maremma and Pyrenees, donkeys, mules, and llamas, and also on-farm training for the guardian animals was eligible if it was done by a third-party certified professional. So this is where, for farms that have had to put in a claim to the Crop and Livestock Insurance Commission, this program funding is intended to be available to help with some prevention measures to stop damage from happening in the future.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, sorry, I'm just going back between comments here and just gonna hit send on a comment. All right, we're going to flip over to the Q&A, and I saw Trisha, you were responding in the section as well, and I'm just going to read those for folks in case they don't have that functionality on their phone. So there was a question related to the spring bear hunt, and the response was, currently we're not looking at hunting as a way to reduce the population. Research suggests hunting does not decrease reported human-bear conflict unless conducted at very high and unsustainable levels. The other question that was answered was, does DNR still offer exemptions for the management to be done at night? And night hunting is currently not permitted. If snaring for bear, snares can be left set during the night and checked at appropriate intervals. So those were the ones we had answered. And then I will just read the question, and whoever wants to tackle that can answer it. I expect they are mostly DNR questions. But the first question up is, there were 12,195 bear tags sold in 2023. Only 740 bears were harvested. Why are only 3 bear tags easily available?
Yeah, I can take that, Carolyn. So I'm Andrew Boyne, I'm the Director of Wildlife for the province. I mean, the 12,000 tags, of course, is a bit misleading, because the majority of those, like over 7,000, are free tags given out to seniors, and many seniors come into our offices, and because hunting tags are free, they ask for one of everything and don't necessarily use them. But I think with this, in general, I mean, the whole human wildlife conflict stamp process is not it's not intended to be a second hunting opportunity, right? This is about reducing damage to agricultural resources. So, we're giving 3 tags out easily, based on Adam's question, but we're not limited to 3. If there's more damage happening, we are prepared to issue more tags. It just requires a second ask. So we're trying to balance that issue. We're not trying to provide another opportunity for more people to harvest bears. And like the answer that Trisha put in writing, at the time right now, we're doing work to try to understand the bear population in Nova Scotia, better. Right now, we still don't really have an understanding of exactly what the population is. We suspect, based on what we're seeing, that the population is certainly healthy, but we're doing some work to understand the population better. But at this point, we're not looking at hunting or increasing take of bears as a way to manage or reduce the population.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. And I didn't introduce you at the beginning. So thank you for doing that introduction, and thanks for being here. The other question we have is, can you please speak to the laws regarding active livestock attacks from bears, coyotes, or crows, and what tools farmers have to maintain their animal welfare during attack versus having to wait for a tag to come in?
Unless Tricia has a better answer than I do on this one. Admittedly, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't believe that our regulations in the Wildlife Act would speak to that. Certainly for public safety, you're fine. But if you're talking about, a bear, going after livestock and whether or not you can shoot that bear while it's attacking your livestock, we may have to circle back on that one to get a clear answer. I mean, common sense would suggest that you're probably fine in that case, but as we all know, common sense doesn't necessarily always manifest itself in regulation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, if you ever come across that one, Tricia, but I don't think we've thought much about that kind of scenario.
Yeah, and so I've only been working here since December 2021, and this hasn't come up since I've started, but I've heard of in the past. And so in the past, generally how this is approached is, if there is really solid evidence that the attack was taking place and it was done in defense of livestock, then it is essentially, everything's fine. How we would do that administratively, I'm not sure if we give you a tag or afterwards. It's not come up, but we don't, to my knowledge, have actual laws or policies on kind of the preventative actions. It's usually after damage that we have current leeway. So whether that would ever get changed under the regulations currently, they just don't address this situation. So if it happens, we would do our best to approach it under how we could using common sense.
Thank you for that. Maybe something that we can circle back on after as well. It has been something that we've heard a bit at the Federation in terms of some of those challenges. So we can circle back on that.
Both of our answers were a little bit blurry, but I think the clearest answer is that no, there is no regulatory allowance to shoot a bear while it was attacking your wildlife, livestock. That currently does not exist.
Thank you. The next question, why can raccoons be hunted at night but not nuisance wildlife?
And so they're actually not allowed to be hunted at night. There's no night hunting, but they can be trapped. And so, trapping, snaring, those activities can be done through the night. And then there's, there's expectations of trappers and snarers that they have to check their traps so frequently, and whether they're using live or kill traps. And so, but no, there isn't currently night hunting.
I see we have one raised hand, but I'm going to do the 3 questions that came in first, and then we'll flip over to Heather for a live question. Question, how do I document constant deer, non-migratory geese that camp out on fields? This morning on my way to feeding my outwintered cows, drove past over 20 deer on home farm alone.
Yeah, and this, in past when we had do site visits, obviously a site visit is only a point in time, but we take other information into consideration. And so if you're seeing that, just take some pictures. And then, and if that's your field and it's the time you want the action done, then you can apply for a human wildlife conflict stamp at that time. If it's something you just want to use as, it's not damaging anything right now because my crop is not growing, and I want that as additional evidence when, it's the spring or summer when they are doing damage, we take that all into consideration. And we take that into consideration for the number of stamps that we provide. So if, because some questions come like, how many stamps do we give out? Well, we look into how many deer did you see? And often in the past, we would put up trail cameras and things like that to see how many animals are actually frequently in the area. But if you already have that information, that helps us make those decisions faster. So I'd highly recommend documenting it, even if it's just a picture or a video.
Thank you. Our next question, $250 seems like a low amount to think about controlling wildlife. Maybe a percentage of acreage or financial loss might be considered. Example provided was 10%. David, I don't know if that was specific to wildlife compensation or the wildlife human human conflict tags, but if you wanted to clarify that, I'll give you a moment to clarify and maybe we'll move to some of the online pieces unless someone has an answer to that comment.
How I'm reading it, and I could be wrong, David, so feel free to make an addition to your question, is that so the $250, that's the bar, so that if you head up to $250 worth of damage, then you can get a human wildlife conflict stamp. If it was only $100 worth of damage, then we're not considering that yet, unless it was 2 acres. And so I don't know if maybe there was just a misunderstanding there. And so as soon as you have that $250 worth of damage, you are eligible. And obviously it's a relative term. Like, we're going to look at pictures, we're going to look at the evidence you bring in, and we're going to make a judgment call based on also the information that you provide. And if we need to lean on our partners in the Department of Agriculture, well, it's like, well, how much does this cost? And with the cost of living being so high right now, it's not a very high bar for you to be eligible for stamps.
And I think just to chime in, if there was a misunderstanding between different programs, like on, I don't want to speak for Alicia, but on the crop and livestock insurance side, the threshold to trigger a claim is again $250 of damage, but that's not what the payment would be. The payment would be assessed based on the lost livestock or damaged crop. And then for the program funding to implement wildlife damage mitigation measures, the maximum amount of funding is $15,000, or was in 24-25, so 50% cost share up to $15,000, and then also a maximum of 10% of farm income, whichever is less. So a farm with $100,000 of income would have a $10,000 maximum for the program, but it's much more than $250.
And sorry, just before we move on, Carolyn, I just remembered in the previous question that geese were mentioned as well. And just so geese, we actually don't manage. They're a federally managed species. So if you're having issues with geese, we get a lot of calls about geese, but we're not allowed to do anything about them. There is a permitting process through Environment and Climate Change Canada. So if you're having geese issue, I encourage you to reach out to them. They also have some really good resources on prevention for geese on their websites. So unfortunately, we don't manage that species.
And in terms of wildlife compensation for geese or for deer or whatever, there is often ongoing feeding, and that's where sort of contacting us when you first see the thing happen is still, even if you think it's not enough yet or you think it's going to get worse, contact us at the beginning, and then we stay in touch with clients, with producers all year until we get to a point where sometimes you have geese pulling like corn in the spring, and we'll kind of work through that with you until the point when the corn gets big enough that, you know, the geese aren't pulling it and they move on, and then we'll evaluate the loss and assign a compensation payment to it.
Thank you. And there was a question around dog training, if the department had a list of qualified trainers. So the department doesn't maintain a list. Does anybody have references on where somebody could go to find that list, or is that currently a gap in information that's easily available?
From the department perspective, every time we've tried to maintain a list like this, it gets out of date so quickly, and it's hard to have a complete list. So unfortunately, it means you have to find your own trainer. I think, you know, if I were a farmer looking for that, I would try posting in Farming in the Maritimes or one of those big Facebook groups, and I'm sure that there would be a lot of recommendations.
Thank you. All right, we'll now move to Heather King for her question. And you'll just have to unmute.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. She had mentioned about the meat having to be distributed, like you couldn't keep it for yourself. So if I had a tag and we got deer, where do we bring? Normally we would cut it up, clean it, and cut it up ourselves within our own stuff. If the meat has to be donated, which is not an issue, does it have to go to an inspected slaughterhouse? Because We only have one around here and they're very, very busy.
Yeah, Heather, thank you very much for your question. And so I guess the goal here is that we're trying to support Feed Nova Scotia as much as we can, and you know, through the programs that we can issue. And so, but there are some times when that's not possible. And I'm not sure about your region down near Yarmouth, but your local technician would have information on, they have to be approved butchers for wildlife to be submitted to Feed Nova Scotia, and there are only a handful in the province. And so if you were not near in, you know, a reasonable distance to one of those butchers, then the conditions would change. We also have left it a bit open to a technician discretion in the terms and conditions if it needs to go to Feed Nova Scotia or not. In the end, we want to make sure that the meat's not being wasted, you know, that it's getting used as much as possible. And you know, obviously it'd be great to support the Feed Nova Scotia, but as long as it's getting eaten, that, you know, that's what we want. If it's appropriate, if it's not, you know, if you're harvesting in the middle of the summertime, it's just too hot, then that's not appropriate for anybody to be eating. So, but yeah, I would encourage you when you're applying to work with your local technician, and they will help you figure out whether it's appropriate for you to keep it, or if it needs to go to the feed bank, the Feed Nova Scotia.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question from Dean Cole.
Here we are. Oh, we're there?
Yes, you are.
Good. I have a quick question about starlings. They're an invasive species. I see certain products in the States, one called Starlingside, is available to help reduce by maybe hundreds of the starlings that we have. I mean, they do tremendous damage on crops that have already been harvested, corn silos, snap leach, even in the heifer barns. So has there been anybody look at getting Starlingside into Canada and used?
Yeah, Dean, thank you very much for your question. And this is one that's been actually coming up a lot more frequently in the last couple of months. And it's something we're looking into because it's starlings. They're so challenging and they're so dedicated to making damage, I find. With any product that we are providing that might act as a type of poison, particularly when we're talking about birds, it's very challenging because it's really hard to get the target species and to make sure we're getting the target species. We have a lot of birds, there's a number of birds that would not be an appropriate target for these products. And we do have species at risk as well that we have to consider. And so this is a question that we are currently looking into. We do appreciate the struggles with, you know, whether it's starlings or pigeons or some other particularly birds that are just challenging. So we are looking into it, but it's a tough one because we need to make sure that we're not hurting a species that we're not trying to target. So there will be more information on that when we finish looking into this question a little deeper.
And I do know that Starlicide, which is also known as DRC 1339, is not approved for use in Canada right now. And to get it approved would be a federal process of going through the chemical management program at Environment Canada or maybe even with Health Canada. So right now that's not an option, but there are, like Tricia said, there are other things that are used here. But it's complicated. But do appreciate the fact that there are a ton of starlings out there, just on farms, in cities, everywhere. It's a problem.
I just want to follow up. I'm sure there's folks on the line that know as well, but we did have 2 resolutions combined into one this year at our annual meeting regarding starling control. So we'll continue that conversation as well beyond today. Are there any other questions from folks? Not seeing anything that any of the panelists would like to cover following questions. Okay. I think that we are set then. So I want to thank Alicia, Andrew, Tricia, and Rebecca all for joining us today. We will be sharing this recording, and we made some notes as well. We'll try to get some of that information that folks had asked for to share as a follow-up to this. And if you have any questions after this session, please feel free to reach out to us as well with the email that you received the link in, and we can share that with folks at DNR and NSDA. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day.